I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 10, Sunday, February 2nd, 2025. The lesson is entitled Healing a Man Born Blind. Lesson text comes from John chapter 9, verses 1 through 17. Related scriptures are John 8:12 through 20, 9:18 through 41, 12:35 through 50. The place is Jerusalem. The time is 29 AD. In this last lesson of the second unit, we see Jesus' power again in the healing a blind man. He shows us he is the light of the world to those who are in darkness. Today's aim, facts, to show how Jesus healed a blind man and how the man answered questions about Jesus' actions. Principle, to present Jesus as the light of the world to those who live in darkness. Application, to show that with Jesus as our Savior, we are able to better understand our difficulties. Illustrating the lesson, Jesus is the light of the world for us today. He guides us through difficult situations. Practical points. 1. People use the sins of others to reassure themselves that similar tragedies will not happen to them. John 9, 1 through 2. 2. God can use even tragedies to show his saving power. Verse 3. 3. The light of Christ is the light of the world. He illumines the path of life. Verses 4 through 5. 4. God's creative power can transform and heal people who are otherwise incurable. Verses 6 through 7. 5. As soon as Christ is given credit for something good, unbelievers try to discredit it somehow. Verses 8 through 13. 6. God's law is never against showing compassion. Verses 14 through 17. Golden text. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. John 9, 5. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is a miracle, John 9, 1 through 7. The second is a wave of skepticism, John 9, 8 through 13. The third is a controversy, John 9, 14 through 17. Introduction. Throughout his ministry, Jesus was repeatedly confronted by Jewish religious leaders who opposed everything he said and did. John 8 is an example of this. First, they brought Jesus to a woman caught in adultery and tried to corner him into speaking against the Mosaic law, verses 1 through 11. When he declared himself to be the light of the world, verse 12, they accused him of having no witness to validate that. This was followed by a heated exchange about who his father was and an accusation that he was demon-possessed. On the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus declared himself to be the source of living water, 7:37 through 39. In chapter 8, he declared himself to be the source of spiritual light. Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. Verse 12. Jesus proceeded to prove in a practical way the truth of what he had said about being the light of the world. Soon after he made the claim, he was faced with a man living in physical darkness, and he gave him the ability to see. A miracle. John 9, 1. And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Verse 3. Jesus answered, Neither have this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Verse 4. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. Verse 5. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Verse 6. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spattle. And he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, verse 7, and said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Shalom, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way, therefore, and washed and came seeing. The blind man, John 9, 1 through 2. Apparently, it was soon after the Feast of Tabernacles, 7:2, that Jesus and his disciples came across a man in Jerusalem who had been blind since birth. He must have been well known, for the disciples knew of the longevity of his condition. The blind man had resorted to begging, 9:8. He was not allowed to beg on the Sabbath, verse 14, but by being there on that day, he increased his exposure for help on the other days of the week. No doubt there were other blind people around, but Jesus had a lesson he wanted to teach through this particular one. Jesus' disciples held the typical Jewish attitude of the day that physical malady indicated God's displeasure with the person and constituted judgment against him. The question in their minds was, had he himself sinned, or was he bearing judgment because of some sin committed by his parents? Their thought might have stemmed from the statement in Exodus 34:7, which says that God will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children unto the third and to the fourth generation. Their question was a bit strange. If the man was being punished for a sin he committed, it had to be a prenatal sin. It is not clear that the disciples expected Jesus to heal this case. They are puzzled by the Jewish notion that sickness was a penalty for sin. The book of Job had shown that this was not always the case, and Jesus shows it also, Luke 13, 1 through 5. If this man was guilty, it was due to prenatal sin on his part. A curious notion, surely. The reason he was blind, John 9, 3 through 5. Jesus responded with a twofold answer. First, this man's blindness was not the result of anyone's sin. It is good to take note of this, because there are those who quickly accuse anyone who is suffering from illness or adversity of being under God's judgment. Often bad things happen in the normal course of nature, and it is not the judging hand of God in action against us. While it is true that God chastens for sins, not all suffering is the result of specific personal sins. The second part of Jesus' answer was that the man's blindness had occurred so that God could do a revelatory work in him. Homer Kent noted, God must not be held morally responsible for the evils in the world, but nevertheless, he often incorporates such situations into his plans to accomplish the ends he desires. The emphasis in Jesus' words was not, however, upon the theological explanation of the origin of sin, but upon his ability to deal with it. It was through Jesus that the revelatory work would be done. He was present on earth to do the works of his Father, and he referred to his time here on earth as day, verse 4, which ties in with his being the light of the world. The time was coming, however, when he would no longer be able to do what he was doing. He referred to that coming time as night, perhaps meaning the Passion Week and his crucifixion. The light he was providing as the light of the world, verse 5, was going to be extinguished. That would not end the light, however. Jesus did not explain here that his work would continue through the ministry of the Holy Spirit. He referred only to the light he was given by being personally present. The means of his healing, John 9, 6 through 7. We know that Jesus did not need physical aids for performing miracles. What he did with this man was somewhat unusual, although on two previous occasions he had done something similar. Mark 7:33 tells of a time when a deaf man with a speech impediment was brought to him, and Jesus took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears, and he spit and touched his tongue in order to heal him. Later, a blind man was brought to him in Bethsaida, and he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. Mark 8:23. The man could see only partially, so Jesus put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up, and he was restored and saw every man clearly. Verse 25. With the blind man in John 9, Jesus spit and made clay to put on his eyes, then told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, verses 6 through 7. Did Jesus have some purpose in using these unusual, unneeded means of healing? No explanation is given in the text, but perhaps these particular people needed something to strengthen and aid their faith. In the case of this man, he had to exercise faith by going to the pool to wash the clay off. When he did, he was healed and he returned with full sight. There was no need for optical growth as in babies, even though he had been born blind. It was a miracle that produced complete ability to see instantly. Verse 7 makes a point of noting that the name Siloam means sent. Jesus had just mentioned that he had been sent by God, verse 4, and now he was sending this man to exercise faith in getting healed. It was the sent one, that is the Messiah come from God, who was sending him. A wave of skepticism, verse 8. The neighbors, therefore, and they which before had seen him that he was blind, said, Is not this he that sat and begged? Verse 9. Some said, This is he. Others said, He is like him. But he said, I am he. Verse 10. Therefore said they unto him, How were thine eyes opened? Verse 11. He answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes, and said unto me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight. Verse 12. Then said they unto him, Where is he? He said, I know not. Verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind, identifying himself. John 9:8 through 9. There was an immediate stirring of interest among the neighbors when this man returned home able to see. He was an adult who had been born blind, and his ability to see now was beyond their belief. An immediate discussion followed. Their question began to circulate as to whether this was actually the same man. They had seen him sitting by the roadside begging because of his inability to see. But now here he was talking about seeing everything for the first time in his life. Some of them dismissed the possibility by saying that this man simply looked like the one who was blind but was not really him. There was a similarity in their looks, but of course it was not possible for someone born blind to suddenly see. Miracles then, as now, were not common or expected among the people, and therefore were not something readily accepted. Mistaken identity was the easiest way to explain what they were witnessing, but this explanation did not satisfy everyone. As he listened to the discussion going on around him, the man assured them that he was indeed the man who had been blind. This reassurance led to further questions. The curiosity of the neighbors is understandable in view of his lifelong condition. Explaining his healing, John 9:10 through 11. Since this man was in fact the one they had always known to be blind, the neighbor's next question was an obvious one. How were thine eyes opened? Verse 10. They were looking at what they considered to be an impossibility for someone who had been born blind and never been able to see, just could suddenly have sight. There had to be an explanation of some kind, and they wanted to hear it. If he had indeed moved from being blind to being able to see, by what means had this happened? The man simply related what had happened, even though he himself did not yet fully understand it all. He told them a man named Jesus had made clay, anointed his eyes with it, and told him to wash in the pool of Siloam. When he did this, his eyes were opened and he was able to see. We learned later that this explanation did not satisfy the religious leaders, who continued to seek more information. They were determined to deny that Jesus had anything to do with this incident, so they questioned the man further. John 9:24 says, "They again called the man that was blind and said unto him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner." The man stated that he did not know whether Jesus was a sinner, but that he did know he had been miraculously healed of his blindness. When the Pharisees still asked for information about how it had happened, the healed man countered, "I have told you already, and ye did not hear. Wherefore would ye hear it again? Will ye also be his disciples?" Verse 27. Facing the Pharisees, John 9:12-13. The man's initial encounter with the Pharisees took place when the neighbors could not reconcile in their minds what they were seeing and hearing. They wanted to know where this Jesus was and if he had been there and healed the man. The man had no answer because he had still been blind at the time of his interaction with Jesus. After his return from the pool of Siloam, he had no I he had no idea what the man who had helped him looked like. If Jesus had been right there, he would have known him. It was only later that Jesus would come to him and reveal himself as his benefactor. John 9:35-38. As of now, all the man knew was that it had been the man they all knew as Jesus. Since he had never seen him, he had only one possible response to their question about where Jesus was. "I know not," verse 12. Instead of accepting the situation and rejoicing over what had happened, the neighbors took him to the Pharisees. Apparently, they felt that something this unusual needed the insight of their respected religious leaders. By this time, there had probably been a lot of speculation about who Jesus was. So, although these neighbors might not have encountered him personally, they knew of the controversial sentiments toward him. They knew their leaders were opposed to Jesus, so they must have felt it was important to get them involved in this situation. A controversy. Verse 14. And it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Verse 15. Then again, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He said unto them, He put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed, and do see. Verse 16. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. Verse 17. They say unto the blind man again, What sayest thou of him, that he hath opened thine eyes? He said, He is a prophet. The Pharisees doubt. John 9:14-15. Verse 14 is an explanation by John that almost sounds like, oh, by the way. He did not write it lightly, however, because this is a significant bit of information when it comes to the opposition of the Pharisees. Their very legalistic view of the Sabbath caused them to oppose just about everything Jesus did on that day of the week. It provided them with numerous excuses for condemning him and his ministry. Jesus had come to fulfill the law and was not bound to the legalistically the way the Pharisees were. In fact, he had informed them that he was the Lord of the Sabbath. This occurred during one of his earliest confrontations when the disciples were picking grain and eating it on a Sabbath day. Mark 2:23-28. It was not an issue for him to give this man sight on the Sabbath, but it immediately became an issue for the Pharisees. The Pharisees immediately wanted to hear for themselves the healed man's explanation about receiving his sight, John 9:15. This is the second of four inquiries in this chapter regarding the man's healing. When his answer did not satisfy the Pharisees, they asked his parents about it, verses 18-23. Later, as we already noted, they asked him one more time, verses 24-26. His first response to the Pharisees was an abbreviated version of what he had said earlier to the neighbors. The Pharisees' conclusion, John 9:16-17. The Pharisees had made a long list of specific do's and don'ts regarding the Sabbath in an attempt to explain and put into practice what the scriptures meant when they prohibited work on the Sabbath. Kneading the clay, anointing his eyes, and healing the man were all considered work and therefore forbidden. But because Jesus broke their petty rules, they immediately decided he was not from God. The healed man still had only limited understanding of who Jesus was. He knew a man they called Jesus had healed him. But who Jesus was specifically, he did not know. When the Pharisees asked the man about Jesus, he simply concluded that Jesus must be a prophet, since he was open to the truth. Though he was later introduced to Jesus and became a believer in him. Questions. 1. What was the condition of the man described in John 9? How long had he been that way? 2. What typical Jewish attitude of the day did the disciples express? 3. What did Jesus say about the reason for the man's blindness? 4. What did Jesus do in this case to heal the man, and why might he have resorted to such actions? 5. What question arose in the minds of this man's neighbors, and what did they conclude? 6. When asked where Jesus was, what did the man answer? Why? 7. What did the neighbors do in response to the man's words? 8. What fact did John include to explain the Pharisees' anger? 9. What was the Pharisees' conclusion about Jesus? 10. What conclusion did the healed man draw about Jesus? This concludes the Sunday school lesson for Sunday, February 2nd, 2025. Thank you for listening. Please remember to click the subscribe tab. God bless.